United States. We are joined by board members. Some of our global fellows have called in as well, and we've got an expert panel that's joining us today to weigh in on what's going on, what we need to anticipate, and how as businesses we can prepare. Now, we at this point have two of our three speakers on the line. Still waiting on that third one, but I am reliably assured that he'll be joining us. But this morning on the line, I know that we have Robert Daly, who's the director of our Kissinger Institute on Canada and the United States, as well as Sarah Koudalakos, the executive director of the Canada-China Business Council. Hopefully, any second now, we'll be joined by Sean King, senior vice president of Park Strategies. Our process will be, I'll be asking these folks some questions over the next half an hour or so, and then we'll be opening it up to your questions. If you have a question, we have a very high-tech process for you to just put *1, is that correct, into your phone. The crack team around the table will see the calls come up in queue, and then we'll call your name to release the line and get your question. Here we are looking at Canada, U.S., China, what's happening. You all know that by 2030, China will be the world's largest economy. For businesses in the United States and Canada, the appeal of this market is obvious, but doing business with China and establishing a rules-based framework to do so is a real challenge. Politics and economics are inextricably intermingled. I remember working with the Government of Canada on WTO issues, and one of the things that they said there to sell participation in the multilateral trading system is that to the extent possible for a small trading nation or medium trading nation, you want to have a rules basis for your commercial relationships. And they used to say, you don't want to have to solve a commercial relationship with China over soybeans through a political or diplomatic process. Here we are. The issue is not necessarily soybeans, but the problems are much as we were anticipating. In my opinion, the U.S. is one of the few economies that can offer rules leadership for helping to trade more effectively, more fairly with China. But at the same time, Canada is not necessarily sure that rules leadership from the United States is where it wants to go. Should Canada be following the U.S. agenda? Should Canada be going its own way? I have lots of questions. I don't have lots of answers, so I'm going to turn it over to my experts. And I'm going to start with the questioning with Sarah. From your perspective, as the director of the Canada-China Business Council, could you give us a quick overview on the state of play on the Canada-China diplomatic and trade relationship?
Yes, happy to. So back in November, I would have told you that the overall relationship was in a pretty good state. Economically, we've seen a lot of action. Exports have been up. Canadian brands are making a big push into China. And diplomatically, things are pretty good as well. In fact, in November, at least 5 federal ministers converged on China. Minister McKenna for an annual environmental meeting. We had Morneau, Carr, and Macaulay for the Economic and Financial Strategic Dialogue, and Mr. Bryson, along with 3 Atlantic premiers and delegates from 4 provinces for an Atlantic growth mission. And many of them made CCBC's 40th anniversary AGM a part of their trip. And at that event, the Chinese official participation from the leadership level was the most senior showing we've seen in over a decade at such an event. The fact that this economic dialogue took place, along with a regular series of leader-level, foreign minister, and defense-level dialogues, put the relationship in a solid position. Not perfect. Things like difficulty to getting to a decision on starting FTA negotiations serve to highlight some of the significant differences between our governments. But as CCBC learned from some consultations we did in 2017 about the possibility of a free trade agreement, we found that the majority of the business community really values that sort of warm, productive working relationship by the government, which can be represented by things like those regular dialogues, and that, while hopefully making progress on obstacles allows the companies to move forward in China and allows their customers and partners to comfortably transact with Canadian companies. So then that was November. And then on December 1st, Huawei's CFO Meng Wanzhou was arrested while transiting in Vancouver at the behest of the U.S., and everything changed overnight. 2 Canadians were detained in China, apparently in retaliation, and a third had a drug smuggling jail sentence changed to a death sentence. On Ms. Meng, the Canadian government has until midnight tonight to issue an authority to proceed with extradition, and her next court date is March 6th, next week. But we expect that this legal situation may continue for quite a long time. And I would say the overall situation is best described by a cartoon that someone sent me that has Canada depicted as a tiny beaver being dangled by a gigantic Donald Trump into the mouth, the open mouth of a similarly gigantic dragon. Now, on the trade side, what does that do to trade? I'd say the jury is still out. Caution is being applied from both sides, particularly regarding business travel and tourism. But a lot of business is going on as usual, and the Chinese government has not told officials or companies not to do business with China. We do see some examples of people in China choosing not to stick their necks out too far and being careful. And we do a biannual survey of businesses that is fielding right now and will close over the weekend. So we hope to have some answers soon, and we've added some specific questions to that about the current situation. So, Laura, that's where we stand.
Thank you. And that was great. And I did see that cartoon. It was gave pause, certainly. And we're going to come back to you. We're going to talk about this triangular relationship. But that was a really nice overview of the bilateral. Rob Daly, director of the Kissinger Institute, expert on all things China. Can you give us a quick overview, but from the U.S. perspective, of bilateral China relations?
Well, U.S.-China relations, first leaving aside the triangular relationship, I think it is now understood have changed fundamentally. And a relationship that had been characterized by engagement for the first 40 years is now, I think, contentious for the long term. And the relationship is viewed, I think, in a bipartisan way. I want to keep the sort of the dramatics of the White House out of this analysis as much as possible. I don't think I'll be able to do it entirely. But the relationship is now viewed as a global competition between roughly peer competitors, the United States and China. They're not peers in every index of power, but roughly speaking, they're peers. A competition to shape security architectures, trading regimes, very importantly, the development and regulation of technology, but also various kinds of norms and practices as well as value systems. And so this is a high-stakes competition in which there is still considerable need for competition, and it's generally understood, although not in all quarters, that these two economies are highly integrated, although there has been a repeated call to try to disentangle the two countries if possible. The Trump administration has called through executive orders and also through a State Department study for what they call a reexamination of American defense supply chain resilience. The idea is that our defense supply chain shouldn't be dependent upon China, but of course the defense supply chain is really indistinguishable from the non-defense supply chain, so there's a tendency in this administration to want to disengage with China. But even among the more moderate Americans who don't call for disengagement, there's recognition that we have a more fundamentally contentious relationship across almost all spheres of national interaction.
Okay. Good, great intro. Thank you, Rob. And I didn't want to interrupt you during your opening statement, but if you could speak a little closer to your mic next time around.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
No, it was good, but closer to the mic would be great next time. And I understand, speaking of technical bonus, Sean King, have you joined us?
I have indeed. Can you hear me?
I'm delighted. I'm sorry for the challenges at the beginning. You didn't hear me, but I blamed it on the snow in D.C. We blame everything on snow in D.C., and that's what we're blaming our technical challenges on. But we're delighted to be joined by Sean King, Senior Vice President, Park Strategies, and there was another fellowship that I was going to mention, and I can't find my piece of paper. What's the additional affiliation you wanted me to mention, Sean?
Affiliated Scholar at Notre Dame Institute for Asia and Asian Studies.
Thank you. Okay, so Sean, you've heard from the Canadian, and Rob's given the U.S. perspective. Can you talk about the? Okay, yeah, we're going to go to. Can you talk about the U.S.-China business relationship?
Well, I would pretty much agree with what Rob said, and it's good that he didn't get into the bombast of the Trump administration because, in fact, if you look back, I think the pull away from China had already started under Obama. The Obama administration had nixed several Chinese investments on national security grounds, and when Obama went all in on TPP, he marketed it, certainly in the 2016 election year, rightly so, as a regional counterweight to China. And even though I agree with that, I think he did the package disservice by focusing only on the strategic. It was almost as if he didn't believe enough in the economic fundamentals to overplay the China angle. But I would just want to say that the move away from China, which has obviously been sensationalized under Trump, it had already started before that. And the Canada-China tensions, I think, have helped China hawks in the U.S. because it means Canada, our closest trading partner, has fewer options with China right now. So they might need us more in the short term. And for those people on the fence about China, how they're treating Canada for following through on its treaty obligations with the U.S. is a chance to show people what China is really all about. So I think that right now, Canada's estrangement from China is helping U.S.-China hawks. Overall, the U.S.-China business relationship is tense. A lot of the big China boosters have become disappointed in it. That said, I feel Trump's going to choke and end up signing a deal that is a lot less than he had ever promised. And as far as enforcement, there's not really going to be a mechanism except for going back to tariffs. And I don't know if everyone's ready for that again. So I think it's choppy at best.
Right. Now, Sarah, you've been in the business relationship game for a long time. What are you seeing from a Canada-China business perspective? Are contracts being canceled? Are Canadian investors pulling out? Are Canadians in a much riskier situation now than they were 2 or 3 months ago? What are you seeing?
So, I mean, it's still early days to be able to see fundamental impact of this. As I said earlier, a lot of business is going on as usual, and companies that are there are, in general, not stopping what they're doing. And we've had some recent wins, things like Tim Hortons opening its first store on Tuesday in an office building in downtown Shanghai, and they had lineups down the block. Ditto for Canada Goose, which opened on December 31st, and they did delay that opening by 10 days in this fairly unstable environment. But when they did open up, the reason they had to hire security was not for issues of this bilateral tension, but because there were so many people lined up to buy the coats. Anecdotally, as we talk to our members, we've heard examples here and there of deals being canceled or postponed. But I think everybody understands that the fundamental reasons for doing business with China have not changed. It provides still 30% of the world's global growth every year. And, a lot was made of the 2018 growth numbers being the lowest in 30 years. But as people like Simon Rabinovich pointed out, that is about $1.2 trillion of additional demand, and that's twice as much as China was generating when it had 14% growth in 2007. And I think there's still, overall, worldwide, some concern about China slowing and what slowing growth might do to certain sectors, but that's not related to the bilateral issues. I think the more important thing for Canada is that we were already overall, I would say, under investing in the China opportunity. A lot of companies had been on the fence for a long time, and companies who may have been thinking about putting China into their potential diversification plans are now more likely to go elsewhere. Canada has the CETA agreement with Europe, and we're part of the CPTPP, which gives companies a lot of other choices, even if none of those countries are growing at a rate like China's. Also very important to the current economic relationship are sectors like education, tourism and things like seafood exports that demand on Chinese consumer preferences being positive toward Canada. So I think there's a hope that those won't be impacted in the long term. But in just the few months since this started, it's been difficult to conclude anything related to that.
Right. So I think what I hear you saying is, use your due diligence, be cautious, but it's still a right market for Canada to do business. Yeah?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to Sean. What kind of advice would you give businesses about doing business in China?
I would say be very careful and look elsewhere for opportunity.
Okay, same question, Robert Daly.
I think Sean alluded to it earlier. While obviously a good business opportunity in China is a good business opportunity in the short term, some judgment has to be made about China's willingness to take Canadian hostages and to impose death penalties, especially if we think back a few years to China's behavior in the Garrett case. This is, I think it's now safe to say, characteristic of China's approach, and it has to be taken into consideration. Canada is treated by China as what China would call a xiaoguo, or a little country. And China has been in recent years fairly bombastic and tends to, take names and now to take captives if these small countries thwart China's will. Now, that is a little bit too sweeping as a blanket characterization in light of all of the activity that's ongoing, as Sarah has mentioned. But I think it's that no responsible government can fail to make a judgment about that or to take that into consideration as it goes forward.
Okay. I just want to agree with Bob. We saw that in South Korea 3 years ago with the deployment of the Terminal High Aerial Altitude Defense THAAD anti-missile battery. The U.S. military, at its own cost, deployed it in South Korea, yet China stopped tourism to South Korea and banned Korean pop stars from visiting the mainland. When Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen called Donald Trump to congratulate him, they blamed her and were afraid of criticizing Trump. And then, of course, when they let the Dalai Lama visit Norway, they banned all Norwegian salmon. So China seems to be scared of the U.S. or scared of Trump, but anybody else who works with us on anything, they'll go after them and stay away from us.
Right. I want to go to the issue of not soybeans, but tech leadership. I think this really is at the crux of a lot of our conversations and concerns about China and the rest of the world. Are we facing a battle for tech leadership in the world between China and the U.S.? And if so, or if not, how does this battle play out over the next 10 years? Let's start with Sarah on this question.
Well, I think there's a real fear that if the world becomes bifurcated, where you either have to sign on to a tech system led by the U.S. or a tech system led by China, that it significantly limits opportunities. And for countries like Canada, sort of we middle power countries, we would prefer to be able to trade with the whole world. And I think it brings up the question of, again, how does the world on a multilateral basis react to China's behavior on so many fronts? And is there a way for the U.S. to take leadership that aligns perhaps better with what it was doing 50 years ago than in recent years to try to help the world get through this, rather than creating a situation of sort of two completely different systems?
Yeah, and if we needed leadership at any point, we definitely need it now. I was on a call with some Canadian officials, and they were very excited about the fact that we're restarting e-commerce discussions within the WTO, or renewing e-commerce discussions within the WTO, and it would include China, and 76 countries have signed on, and that's terrific. But they're actually working from a 1998 e-commerce text. It's been buffed up a little bit, but it boggles the mind that a 20-year-old text would be the basis for developing new rules on digital commerce in the WTO. Same question for Robert. Battle for tech leadership between China and the U.S. How does this play out?
Well, first, Sarah said she didn't want to choose between a tech system led by China and a tech system led by the U.S. One of the problems the United States has that it hasn't faced up to yet is that there is no tech system led by the U.S. We don't have any companies that can compete with Huawei. The two major competitors, neither of which has Huawei's capacity, are Nokia and Ericsson, both of which build many of their routers and servers in China, where they could be subject to the same kinds of insertion of backdoors or microchips, if those things are going on, that Huawei is subject to. So there's a real problem here of capacity. America is issuing a lot of warnings. It isn't providing a lot of options, and this is an issue even on American soil. So there has been, while I take the concerns about Huawei absolutely seriously, and it is very clear that Huawei, like any Chinese company, state-owned or nominally private, will do anything that Beijing asks it to do, and will also refuse to do anything that Beijing, asks it to refuse to do. I think that is clear. But we confuse our terms in America, and I think that this is problematic for our friends and allies, as well as for Chinese, as well as for Americans. We're going to have 10:30 on Monday morning at the Wilson Center, if you want to tune in, an hour-and-a-half expert dialogue about this. And it's about trying to frame Huawei properly. We speak simultaneously as though our concern is technological, Huawei's capacity to carry out espionage and to threaten the American digital infrastructure and economies. We also say that we are concerned about commercial industrial competition going forward, which is a different frame and a different look at the issue. And then there's the broader claim about geostrategic competition and preferring American leadership and norms generally. And of course, these are different kinds of claims. Some are specific and technological. Some really boil down to sort of a good America, bad China, who do you trust over the long-term approach. And because we've confused our terms, I think it's hard to have a clear discussion about Huawei so far. We're going to try to clear this up on Monday.
Great. I would ask the same questions, Battle of the Titans, to Sean, but before I do, let me remind the listeners that questioning hour is coming up, and if you want to be in the queue to ask a question, press *1 on your telephone dial. Sean, Battle of the Titans for technological supremacy in the world?
I don't see it as America versus China. I see it as free versus non-free. I would be just as troubled, say, if Orascom Telecom from Egypt, which had developed North Korea's cell phone network, suddenly started moving into friendly countries. So I don't think we should be pushing, even if we had the technology, if Samsung goes in somewhere, I'm not going to be bothered by it. Now, Bob raised a very good question of the switches going back to China. That's another issue for technical people to look at. But as long as the company is from a free, friendly country that is not ultimately beholden to the state, as any Chinese telecom company would be, I think that's the way we should go, as opposed to American versus China. And one thing I think Trump has done a lot of damage. Canada suffered a lot for our behalf here on this Meng Wanzhou thing. For him to suggest trading her freedom for a trade deal would cheapen U.S. justice and show that American justice is for sale, and then nobody would ever believe us again on any charge we brought. And, Pompeo and Pence have gone around the world without getting into what she did or whether the guilt or not. I'll just leave that to the experts. But after Pompeo and Pence go to Munich and everywhere else telling people not to use Huawei, if then we throw that as a bonus to China in a trade deal, I think nobody will listen to us again, and they'll probably just go use Huawei anyway.
Okay. I want to bring it back to possible areas of U.S.-Canada collaboration, but you do raise the question of whether or not this is an appropriate time for U.S.-Canada cooperation. First of all, is Canada willing to trust the U.S. on anything in a collaborative sense? And are the proposals that the U.S. might put forward things that Canada could agree with? Sarah, back to you. Can you talk about areas that Canada and the U.S. might cooperate on in terms of its future economic relations with Canada, with China, and whether or not it's a good climate for that kind of cooperation?
Well, I mean, despite the tense situation, I think that Canada will always treat the U.S. as its most important trading partner. And I think if you look at the core issues in the U.S.-China relationship right now, tariffs are one thing, and China's use of tariffs has serves to alienate some of the other countries that are really on its side on the other parts of the economic relationship problem, which are things like forced technology transfer, domestic industrial policies that benefit Chinese companies at the expense of international companies. And I think there's a real opportunity for countries of the world to unite against those kind of policies, and they can benefit everybody equally. And, from our perspective, our companies want to be able to compete in China on their own merits. They don't want to be told what sort of company structure they have to have, or that they have different incentive policies than Chinese companies. And that's something that, if it changes, is good for American or European or Canadian companies alike. And so, again, I think the U.S. bringing allies on side and ganging up, so to speak, on China can have significant benefits, and I think Canada would be very much on board with that.
Great. Rob, you've been spending some time in Canada lately, enjoying the snow and cold weather. Do you see any areas where Canada-China could cooperate more and better, and is this the time for that to take place?
Canada-U.S.
Sorry, yes, Canada-U.S. on China. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I think the big difficulty here, and I said I tried to take the current administration off the table initially, but here I think that we have to put it back on because one of the issues that we have with China worldwide, and right now particularly with Canada, is that while I think the Trump administration has correctly called China out on various fronts and has said that this relationship is now rivalrous in many respects, it hasn't yet woken up to the fact that we need better relations with allies if we are going to manage this contentious relationship with China well. And rather than strengthening those relationships, we've been alienating other countries, including Canada. And so I think there's a fundamental strategic decision that is yet to be made about whether we can afford to attack all nations simultaneously for whatever complaints we have with them, or whether we need to prioritize and really focus on competition with China and therefore dial down our trade and other disagreements with Canada and other nations for that sake. And until we do that, if you can't count on American rough partnership week to week or month to month, I think it's going to be a little tough to sketch out a workable program for closer cooperation. I assume it's obviously much of that is up to Canada and what Canada makes of its current conditions. It's unfortunate that with the Meng Wanzhou situation, Canada, which I would say is by far the most blameless of the three nations, is paying the highest price.
Yeah. I mean, as I said before, in talking about the economic relationship between the U.S. and Canada over the past year and a half, as we went through the NAFTA-USMCA negotiations, the one thing about Canada is you kick them, you slap tariffs on them, you tell them they're national security risks, and Canada will continue to be a good, reliable trading partner because that's what Canadians do. But at the same time, I think that the past year and a half or so have really affected Canada's impulse towards automatic cooperation. It used to be U.S. said, here's what we need, and Canada would say, we got your back. I don't think that automatic impulse is there at this point, and that's currency that will have to be earned back. Sean, in our pre-call, you talked about some of the instruments of either collaboration or a potential collaboration, and that would be the CPTPP, which the U.S. has pulled out of, and also some instruments of potential coercion. And you mentioned the USMCA Section 3210, the so-called China clause, that allows the U.S. to withdraw from the agreement if another party does a deal with a non-market economy, i.e. China. Do you want to talk about some of these mechanisms and where you see them going?
You call it coercion, I call it sticking together. But now is the perfect time for us to work more closely with Canada than ever. And I thought the Meng Wanzhou incident would be a wake-up call for the administration to stop all this ridiculous bashing of Canada and realize who our real friends are. But it hasn't seemed to change anything. They're like, okay, thank you very much, next. Unfortunately, the administration is so bilateral focused on everything. I don't see Trump ever reaching out to Canada or really anybody to counteract China. Everything's going to be him versus the world, because we're also fighting with Japan on a lot of things that we shouldn't be at a time when we need them more than anybody else. Although perhaps the breakdown of the North Korea summit will raise Shinzo Abe's stock in Washington as a result thereof. There also seems to be some kind of personal animus between Trudeau and Trump. I think with the signing of this anticipated trade deal with China, it'll be Xi Jinping's second visit to Mar-a-Lago, and I don't think Trudeau's been there once yet. And we saw in June what I call the G6+1 in Quebec, how much bad blood there seems to be. And, the USMCA, which Trump touts as the greatest deal ever, which really is just warmed over Mexico and Canada portions of TPP, hasn't even yet gone to Congress. And with the way things are going and some Democrats wanting impeachment, they may not want to give him a win, even if they largely support it. I think leaving the TPP was the self-inflicted wound of a generation. It was an anti-China power play in position, and we left it. And that would have been a great place for leadership with Canada. Now it's basically being led by Japan and Canada. On Section 32.10, I don't see it as a restriction of sovereignty because Canada willingly joined NAFTA and now USMCA. I think this is a benevolent, peaceful use of American economic might versus military. And nobody forced anybody to join USMCA. And these are the terms we're able to draw. You're willing to join, so be it. Also on the pre-call, we noticed that Prime Minister Trudeau had walked away from an FTA with China because they weren't down with his progressive trade agenda. Now, I may not be that progressive myself, but I totally respect him for sticking to his guns. So it's not as if a Canada-China FTA was in the offing anyway. And just on the technology transfer issue, I'm sort of adopted the Wall Street Journal, Bob Davis's language on this and stopped calling it forced technology transfer and called it coerced technology transfer because nobody forces these companies to go to China. But if you do, these are the deals you have to make. So I think that no time is better to work with Canada. I just sadly don't think our administration gets it and ever will.
Right. Well, I'm not sure I would use the same adjectives you would use, Sean, but I agree in principle on the USMCA. I mean, the way that the agreement is set out at this moment anyway is the U.S. can launch a notice of withdrawal on 6 months' notice for no reason, or they can launch a notice of withdrawal because of a relationship with a non-market economy. So one would seem to subsume the other. I'm going to open it. We've got a couple of questions in the queue. I'm going to give a heads up that Eric Miller is at the top of my queue. But I wanted to just go back quickly to Rob and Sarah and see if you had any comment about the TPP, CPTPP. What future effect can we expect this agreement to have on relations with China? Any effect? And what about the loss of the U.S. in that deal? Is it significant? Rob, do you have any thoughts?
That's simply to echo everything that Sean said. I'm in complete agreement. And there is even a chance now that China would join before the United States joined. That could be a few years off, but it's actually a terrific opportunity for China if it chooses to pursue it. This was more than an own goal. It was a disastrous policy on our part.
Yeah. Sarah, CPTPP?
Yeah, I would agree on CPTPP with what the others have said, and certainly if China could be brought into it, it just makes the rules easier to understand and live by. I mean, one of the other things companies have told us is, I just want to know what I need to do in China, and I don't want to have inconsistent application of them in different parts of the country. That sort of clarity can be very, very helpful. On the USMCA, I think the inclusion of that clause is yet another way of the U.S. Stressing the issues that it has with China. And it was already pretty clear by things like CFIUS and some of the deals that have been turned down. And Laura, like you said, it was always the case that the U.S. could have pulled out, and this could have been the reason it was pulled out. Now it's just written down that much more clearly.
Thank you. All right, so
Can I make two quick bonus points?
Two bonus points, Sean. Quick bonus points.
Not exactly the best analogy, but I think China joining TPP would be like the Soviet Union joining NATO, but it's our own damn fault for giving them the opportunity by leaving. So shame on us. And on currency and, our extraterritoriality to inflict our will around the world, this just shows how important it is for the power of the U.S. dollar to remain the world's reserve currency, because it gives us the chance to enforce sanctions through anti-money laundering efforts the world over. And when Trump's complaining about the value of the Chinese currency, I mean, who wants their rivals' money to be worth more? It'd be like Ronald Reagan saying he wanted the Russian ruble to be worth more. So I think the longer we can sustain the preeminence of the dollar, the more influence it gives us overseas against our rivals.
Right. Right. Now, I'm gonna be a little gentler on your first point. That is, I don't think trade agreements are necessarily like draft picks in hockey. It's not necessarily important that we finish making the team. We know who everyone who has signed on for the season. What's important is that we are moving forward in establishing new rules that are better suited to the economies that are that are playing in the global sphere. So I think that the existence of the TPP, then CPTPP, has given more consideration to rules that would both benefit and constrain China. We know that China was watching those negotiations. We saw that they were taking a lot of those rules on board in the rest of ASEAN plus India negotiations. So I think there is an evolving regime that isn't necessarily solely written in Western interests, but is also trying to accommodate the interests of developing countries, of China, etc. So the existence of those deals, I think, is still positive no matter who signs on to them. Eric Miller, you have things to say. Please.
Yes. Laura, thank you very much. Eric Miller, I'm a Wilson Global Fellow at the Kennedy Institute. And I wanted to go back to this issue of Article 3210. It seems to me that this is actually quite significant. It is indeed true that the U.S. or any other country could pull out at any time, but this is less the opt-out clause than the boot-out clause. And so what I'm wondering about, and what we're seeing now in the Canada-China relationship, is ultimately about what they call in football field position post-election. And so there have been discussions in Canada about pursuing sectoral agreements with China. You've seen the declaration coming out of the November meetings to that effect. Ultimately, where do we think the limits are that will cause the U.S. to react in a Canadian trade relationship with China, assuming we can get beyond the Meng Wanzhou issue into a better space after the fall elections in Canada? And how significant will the 3210 be in constraining Canadian ambitions on formal trade arrangements with China?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll open it up to any and all of the panelists. I mean, Canada or the U.S. can request that the agreement that they pull out of the agreement. If Canada is completing a deal with China, but what specifically would be the pressure points for the U.S. that would trigger that kind of action? Thoughts, anyone?
So, Sean, my sense is it would have to be a formal FTA. I think the sectoral deals, these things take a long time to negotiate. And who knows who's going to win here in 2020? Who knows Prime Minister Trudeau's future with what's going on this week? These things can take years. I really think for anybody in the U.S. to notice or trigger the clause, it would have to be a full-on FTA. But I'm willing to be proven wrong on that.
All right. Rob?
I would say that if it was anything less than a full-on FTA, then it will probably involve the tech sector, because this has really moved now to the center of U.S.-China relations. One of the things that Beijing and Washington agree on is that henceforth, innovation and controlling the next generation of robotics, nano, quantum, artificial intelligence. This is the key to hard power, economic power, soft power, and this is where Washington is focused right now. And so working too closely with China, with some of these emergent technologies that have implications for not only a country's economy and technology, they have social implications as well. That could perhaps evoke strong enough concerns for America to rethink relations, especially with Five Eye nations. We're not there yet. We're not even close to being in that position. There are too many unknowns. But where rather than sort of older style FTAs, which are just about the exchange of goods and services, it's the tech factor that's likely to be decisive.
Right. One of our sister think tanks in Canada, Public Policy Forum, I think, made a proposal that Canada should step away from a comprehensive free trade agreement idea and focus on specific sectors of interest. Now, recalling back, those of you who are old like me, remember the 80s when Canada tried to do a sectoral FTA with the United States, and it just went at cross purposes. We were interested in trucks and they were interested in agriculture. We couldn't get the kind of alignment on issues until we went for a sort of all-in comprehensive free trade agreement. Maybe this is a different time, and maybe these interests are these dynamics are different. Sarah, I'm going to ask you first. Do you think that a sectoral agreement with China is a good intermediate way to go, not just for Canada, but for any country?
Well, I think that, many people believe that the possibility of a comprehensive FTA is not highly likely, and that even if it were to be achieved, it would take a very long time. Let's say it takes 10 years like Australia's did. In 10 years, China looks very different. The things we can benefit from economically with China may be very different, and a lot of the open space for competing may be already filled by the rest of the world. And there are a lot of countries competing very well in China that don't have FTAs. So I think by thinking about it sector by sector, whether it be formal agreements or just progress, I think there's a sense that will help Canada perhaps keep a pace. On the USMCA, I think I would agree with Rob that technology is one area where beyond a comprehensive FTA, it may trigger things. And I think we've already been seeing over the last year or so sensitivity in terms of Chinese investments, particularly where security can be applied in a lot of different ways. And if Canada took a very, very different approach on receptivity to investment in certain sectors than the U.S. was, I think that would also be much noticed. But our overall trading relationship, I think, is so small with China compared to that with the U.S. that a lot of, if we sell more lobsters, nobody really notices.
Right.
Yeah, I want to also agree, now that Rob mentioned that, I hadn't thought about that. It's a really good point. Technology could be a trigger, especially when it comes to things like facial recognition technology that's being used to throw in a million Uyghurs in jail. I mean, I was in Shanghai in October, and I could tell my picture being taken every block, just the camera flashes. Even last week on the front page of the failing New York Times, there was a story exposing a Massachusetts company for selling this, shaming them for selling this technology to China. So we're not only going after our partners on this, we are actually going after our own company. So yeah, I admit technology could be a sectoral trigger.
Yeah, back up, Robert. Do you want to talk about sectoral agreements either in this specific case, or my question would be, can you do a sectoral deal with China with teeth that sticks?
In the current situation, well, this takes me a little bit out of my zone of expertise. I think what has changed in the United States, and whether this is true for Canadians or not, I don't know, is that within China domestically, and therefore internationally, the current phrase is that politics is in command. You can't have any of these conversations devoid of the political context, devoid of China's global ambitions to shape discourse and attitudes. And this comes back again, and I'm sort of dodging your question because I don't have the specific knowledge for it, but I think it's still a relevant point. Canada and other smaller nations have to make a judgment about China's attitudes toward them as small countries, China's global ambitions, and what limits that places on them. China, as it goes out with what it calls Belt and Road investments, some of which have the potential to provide tremendous public good, many of which are proving harmful. China likes to say that it invests and it trades without Western-style conditions and without political prejudice. But of course, China invests and trades with Chinese conditions. And two of those are often, shut up and do what we tell you. If you're concluding an agreement, you have a robust trading or technological agreement or an investment relationship with China, you really aren't supposed to have an opinion about, say, the South China Sea or the Uyghur re-education camps. And under Xi Jinping, that notion of politics and command internationally is strengthening. And again, I don't mean to, my goal here is not to demonize China across the board and say don't deal with them under any circumstances. I do mean that no commercial or investment relationship can be entirely devoid of or innocent about politics. It's a growing factor.
Right. I also would advise, of course, nobody on this call, I don't think, believes that a full-fledged FTA between the U.S. and China is imminent. But from what I was reading yesterday and today in Inside U.S. Trade and Political Trade, they've come up with 150-ish pages, which include a dispute settlement framework, and that's really good because that's a step above an MOU best efforts. But in trade agreement terms, you can't even say good morning in 150 pages. The NAFTA USMCA was several thousand pages, so 150 pages is really a drop in the bucket. Maybe a great start, but still miles and miles to go for economies of this size and scope. Last call for questions. If there's no *1 questions on our big board here, I will ask my panelists for one last set of insights. 10 years from now, what are we going to be talking in this North America-China relationship? Let's start with Sean. You always have a few.
Yeah, I don't really know because I think it all depends on U.S. leadership. There's a general consensus moving away from China, but I really think it depends on how our next presidential election turns out, because we can fight China alone all we want, and that's good, but we're so much more effective if we have our friends and allies with us. So I don't mean to be sort of kumbaya, one world, but I think we left a lot of money on the table by leaving TPP and always arguing with our allies. And, we discussed this sort of in the pre-call, but we should also take another look at the WTO because, we basically designed it and we bring more disputes to the WTO than anyone, and we have an above-average win rate of 87%. And as of this morning, when I checked, we have 23 outstanding cases against China, and we just won a big grains case against them yesterday. So I don't really think WTO is a good place for reform, but it is certainly a good place for enforcement. And we should get back into TPP, toot sweet. And as Bob mentioned, I'm not going to call Canada a small country. I'll call it a middle power, like South Korea. But small country like Sweden, China's even after them right now on a hotel stay, and they arrested the Swedish bookseller from Hong Kong for publishing books critical of the Chinese Communist Party. So really nobody's safe. Where we are 10 years, I really can't say, but I'm definitely concerned that we're fighting too much on our own and not with our friends.
Right. So despite your support for multilateralism through the WTO, I don't think you're in any danger of being labeled a kumbaya one-worldist, but thank you, Sean. Rob, where are we in 10 years? What does this look like?
Well, no crystal ball. The story of modern China has always been the story of change. It remains the story of change. And the United States has recently changed in ways that I certainly didn't predict and that I still haven't processed. So I'm not going to go the prophecy route. I would note, as we've already touched on, that sort of month to month there's a real gap between what the United States is identifying as major, even in some cases existential security threats, and our unwillingness to make tough decisions and incur real costs to try to combat those threats. I share Sean's concern that we are in fact going to cave at the end of the current trade frictions, which I think we probably enjoy our maximum leverage now, and I think we're going to end up looking like a paper tiger, such that all of these security threats are calling on our allies to join with us to counter China, if in fact we're going to be in the alliance business, will ring hollow because the United States itself lacks a strategic vision, stick-to-itiveness, and a willingness to incur costs. I guess if we're looking 10 years ahead on those grounds, that's a fairly pessimistic forecast, but there's too much in play to look 10 years out. I agree with Sean on that, and American politics is still a big factor.
All right. And Sarah, 10 years out, and maybe you could refine it with 10 years what it likely looks like, and 10 years what you hope it looks like.
Well, one of the things I fear is that with some of the issues in terms of China's focus on the primacy of the party and issues like that 2017 national security law, which is, one of the things that's really dogging the Huawei situation right now, which is where Ren Zhengfei can say all he wants, we won't do something if the Chinese government tells us to do it, and we heard the others on the call today say, well, that's not true. I think that has the potential to impact every Chinese company's globalization strategy, and that may, the global competitive nature of Chinese companies and how they are playing in other parts of the world may look very different in 10 years, depending on how the sort of power of Xi Jinping rubs the rest of the world and how that plays out. In terms of where Canada might be with the U.S. and China in 10 years, I often say that the U.S. is right now in the middle of an existential crisis with China, whereas Canada has a co-existential crisis. We can't ignore the fact that China will play a role in the world in every sphere, and so we can't just close our eyes and hope that it goes away. So I think that what will determine the value of Canada's relationship with China 10 years from now depends on how much successive governments put their A game on dealing with a partner that is not easy to deal with, that doesn't look like us, and figure out how to take a nuanced approach to working with them, always keeping in mind what's in it for Canada and doing it in the best interest of Canada.
Great. A co-existential crisis. I'm not sure if there's a better way to end it. There's a happier and more optimistic way, but I think you hit the nail on the head. Thank you so much. Thank you to our expert panelists, Sarah Koudelakos, Executive Director of the Canada-China Business Council. If you don't know about them, you should. Look them up right away before you forget. Google. Sean King, Senior Vice President, Park Strategies. Really smart guy. Kumbaya, one worldist.
No way. Fake news.
That's right. And my good friend Robert Daly, Director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the U.S. Rob, remind us again, what's your program next week we should watch out for?
It's looking at Huawei and the tech issues generally, trying to frame it properly, Monday morning at 10:30 to noon.
And people can dial in from Canada and all the ships at sea or teleconference?
They can watch a live webcast at wilsoncenter.org.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, panelists. Thank you to all of our board members, global fellows who dialed in today. I know this was extraordinarily useful for all of us. And this is not our last conversation on the Canada-U.S.-China triangle. We will continue to report and monitor as issues emerge. Thank you to my team at the Canada Institute, Savannah Boylan, Jackie Orr, Mariana Sanchez, and to our global fellows, Jim Dickmeyer and Paul Young, who were instrumental in putting this together. Thank you all very much, and we wish you a great day.
Bye-bye.
This concludes our conversation for today. Thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect.